guidance from the medium. In our last story, we learned about Saul's latest pursuit to take David's life. David once again had the opportunity to end Saul, and with him all the fleeing and exile. Yet David's conviction as a man of God stood its ground. He spared Saul, and Saul once again repented and left David's presence. Now David dwells in the land of the Philistines, serving under King Achish. David and his men made raids on the enemies of Israel, pretending to make raids for the Philistines. In this story, the Philistine horde rises up against Israel. David continues to wrestle with his alliances, while Saul, now living apart from the Spirit of God, turns to dark arts to settle his weary and restless soul. Inspired by the book of 1 Samuel. The days grew darker and darker. War between the Israelites and Philistines raged like wildfire. Both sides struck devastating blows, and the spirit of both nations were growing dim. Valleys became swamps with the blood and gore of battle. Villages and towns were destroyed from plunder. Yet the Philistines were great in number, and continued to bang on the drums of war against Israel. David still dwelled with his men and King Achish, and the two became very close. David began to struggle with his identity as a Hebrew while in the presence of Philistine friends. Though he did not slay any Israelites, his association with the enemy made him guilty. However, he could not return to Saul, for his mind was like a tempest, tossing him to and fro. The Philistine horde approached the borders of Israel once again. Saul looked upon the sea of soldiers with fear and trembling. Saul's mind had grown weary and tainted with hatred. His soul was tormented and unsteady. A subtle madness overcame Saul, and since God had removed his spirit from him, there was no rest. Saul had not truly felt peace since David last played songs for him in the throne room. It seemed like 100 years since that time. Samuel, who was his guiding compass, had been long dead. Night had fallen, and the Israelite camp was quiet and dimly lit by torches. Saul walked to the outskirts of camp and fell to his knees. The only sounds were Saul's tears as he wept before God. He buried his face in the dirt, begging God to speak to him once again. Silence. He looked to the stars, listening for any semblance of God's voice. Nothing. Saul sought prophets, but there was no response. Saul waited for dreams, yet he was still met with nothing but torment. Saul arose from his bed and woke up his servant. "Find me the necromancer woman from Endor," he commanded. So the servant departed to find her, and set up a meeting for her and Saul. If God would not respond to his prayers, perhaps another being would lend its ear. So Saul ventured a few miles north to meet her. A different type of darkness covered the city. A shroud of evil hovered over Endor like storm clouds. Saul disguised himself in a cloak to hide his identity, and traveled the alleyways of Endor with secrecy. Saul entered into the necromancer's home. The room reeked of spice and death. Saul uncovered his hood and looked around the room. Dead ravens hung from the ceiling, and incense burned under carved images of wicked gods. The room was dark and lit only by a few faint candles. There, in the corner of the room, a woman sat at the edge of her bed. She was equally revolting and intoxicating. She wore a scalding stare that shook Saul's spine. Saul stood a few feet away from her and whispered, "I need you to bring forth a spirit for me." The woman remained silent and arose from her bed. She passed Saul and circled him like a lioness. "You know that the righteous King Saul has banned all mediums and necromancers from the land. This could very well be a trap for me." The woman spoke with a smooth voice. She did not yet know it was Saul who stood before her. Saul clenched his jaw. "As the Lord lives, I can assure you no punishment will await you," Saul said. He did his best not to stutter when he spoke, for even Saul knew that he was playing with unknown power. The necromancer stood a foot away from Saul and looked him in the eye. She was silent for a few moments, staring at Saul with an uneasy gaze. "Whom shall I bring for you?" she asked. "Samuel, the prophet," Saul said. The woman took a step back and bowed her head. Her hair covered her face as she bent her neck forward. Saul could hear faint mumbles from the woman. She shook her shoulders back and forth, and her mumbles grew louder and louder. The woman began to shake uncontrollably, and a loud scream came out of her. "You deceived me!" the woman shouted. "You are King Saul!" The woman gritted her teeth and pointed toward Saul. "I promise you will not be harmed," Saul said. "Now tell me what you see." The woman's eyes rolled back with her head. She mumbled and jolted her neck back and forth. "I see a man crawling up out of the ground," she said. "He is old and wrapped in a robe." The necromancer began to tremble and scream in fear. She had come in contact with demonic spirits before, but now she was dealing with the Spirit of God. Saul fell on his face before the woman. He knew who she was seeing was indeed Samuel. The woman loomed over Saul, and the tone of Samuel came forth from her voice. "Why have you disturbed me?" he said. Saul looked up, still kneeling on the floor, and said, "I am in great distress. The Philistines are overtaking us, and God has turned away from me. I am lost without guidance. What shall I do?" Tears fell from Saul's eyes, and his hands were shaking. "Why do you ask me? God has made you his enemy, Saul. I told you that he would take your kingdom from you and give it to another. Now you know it to be David." There was a silence for a moment. Saul began to speak until Samuel interrupted him, saying, "Tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me, and Israel will be cast into the arms of the Philistines." Saul lay prostrate on the floor, and the woman shook her head and stumbled backwards. Saul's strength had departed him, and his face grew pale at the news. The woman composed herself and offered Saul food before he left. Saul refused, but his servants insisted, since his face was so pale and deathly. Saul ate in silence on the woman's bed. He stared into the blackness, fearing every moment might be his last. Saul had called forth Samuel to be comforted, but he was met only with more sorrow.